Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined once again by my very good friend, Bryan Dietrich. Hello, Bryan.
Hello.
It is very good to see you, especially now that you're recovered. So that's a bonus.
Thank you. Yeah, I think everybody's glad that they're recovering from something. But yeah, COVID was well, it gave me the sleepy sickness. So I'm over that. And now it's just the regular sleepy stuff.
Well, and now we're going to see AP be really professional because he forgot to pour himself a drink before he started recording. So just ignore the sound of me pouring things. Right.
All right.
So today, my good friend, we are going to have a chat about the Sandman, the Sandman adaptation on Netflix. And I just before, so this people are always asking for me to show stuff that I actually have. So I actually have all of them, but I just brought this one out, and so that people know.
Nice.
Yeah,
Nice. I have all of the volumes, and then this one's still bagged, but Doll's House. And then the other 8 over there, and then the other 3 wandering around various places.
actually, I have those trade paperbacks as well. Because they're basically they're the ones I read because I don't read the absolute edition ones.
Well, and it turns out that the originals are not in print at the moment. And
Really?
a friend on Facebook was asking where they could find them, and I said, "Well, just try Amazon." And they wrote back and said, "No." And so I went and checked, and they're going for extraordinary amounts of money. So
So you're saying, even though I have it personalized, I could maybe sell my absolute editions and then just retire.
no, but you could go for a nice trip somewhere, maybe to the Dreaming,
um,
or just get COVID. Then that just comes.
yeah. Okay. So before we get started in talking through all of this, what were your general impressions about the adaptation? Because before you give yours, just to spoiler alert, I really liked it. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was an excellent adaptation. It changed enough structurally and made minor changes here and there and shuffled a couple of things around to suit the fact that it was more it was a television show rather than the comic book, and it changed just enough that it felt new in places, so I wasn't feeling bored going, I already know what all of this is.
Yeah.
And yet it remained, I think, absolutely true to the spirit and what Gaiman and obviously all of the artists who were involved in creating the Sandman, what they were telling in their stories.
Uh, Agreed. Last time we spoke about comics, we talked about Moon Knight, and I said it was one of the top 3 um, adaptations of comics I've ever seen, certainly on television, if not overall. But now this rises among them. If it's not at the very top, it's in the top 2 or 3. It's extraordinary. Um, I started reading these when they first arrived in 1989, and then read them all the way through to the end, and then wept for a couple of years, and then was excited when other things, well, like Dream Country, well, not Dream, when The Dreaming came out, and when Overture came out, and and other accentuating pieces came out later, I was just delighted. Um, but waiting to see it visualized in a filmic way was something that I never hoped to see. I really, I mean, it's one thing to see a Daredevil or a Black Lightning or a Ms. Marvel come out on the small screen, but it's another, or any screen for that matter. Even seeing, you know, Starro in the second version of Suicide Squad stomping through a city, I never thought that's anything I would ever see in my life. This is far more astonishing because there are things that you just can't imagine visualizing that they could do that. And they did. I have my quibbles as always, but it's a fantastic show.
And that, to be perfectly honest, I don't think either one of us has ever gone, yep, that is absolutely perfect, no changes whatsoever. It did exactly that. We will always have things where we go, I loved it, but because
yeah.
that's the kind of people we are. We always grumble and complain. But in all honesty, I think my grumbles, my complaints, my nitpicks in this are so minor compared to what we got. Like the fact that I think people forget this is a TV show. Even going back 5 years, the visual effects that we were getting in TV, and you look at the visual effects here. No, I'm sure there are some people out there going, "Oh, well, I thought that looked fake," or blah, blah, blah. I was blown away by how good they were. They created a sense of the uncanny valley, that it was just slightly off enough to be unsettling, because the endless are anthropomorphic representations of abstract ideals. Like they are anthropomorphic concepts. And the dreaming is, if we think about dream logic and how our own dreams are, they aren't photorealistic real places. They have bizarre dimensions. And I think Netflix did something with the aspect ratio just to tweak it ever so slightly.
Yes.
That
yes, they did.
It looked slight. It didn't look photorealistic. It was slightly attenuated. And because of that, it gave it an otherworldly feel. And I think that was one of the smartest uses of aspect ratio to create this uncanniness that we get, because dream is permeating everything. And I thought it was a really clever technical thing they did.
Well, even the bridge leading up to the castle, the Morpheus's castle. I mean, there is a bridge very much like that in Vietnam. A real bridge with giant hands holding the bridge, and they've done just enough to, I mean, not including the British guy standing on the bridge looking down going, should I jump off? But just little things along the way to make it uncanny. Well, everything. I mean, I can't even begin to start. Well, I'll actually, in the, jumping to the very end, Azazel, when he shows up. And I thought, that's one thing that we'll never see. As long as I live, we'll never see a rift in space and time with opening and closing mouths and a bunch of eyes. That's not gonna show up on a TV screen or a big screen ever. And they did it, and I was just astonished. And I actually cried for a while watching it. I was just like, oh. And my wife is stroking my shoulder, saying, "It's okay, it's okay." I'm like, "Yes, it's okay. It's better than okay."
I sometimes feel very sorry for her, Brian. I feel very sorry for her having to sit there with you sometimes.
It's well, we both read all of the comics, so we're both just over the moon with this. So,
well, look at why don't we start talking about some of the casting decisions that were made, because I think for the most part, how they cast this, and some obviously are quite significant changes from the representation in the comic book, but I think the casting, the acting, everything was really, really good. That Tom Sturridge,
Yes.
Tom Sturridge was playing Dream, and you know he played Dream as very self-contained, with this sort of implacable face, and he did quite a lot with his eyes, the set of his jaw, his physical sort of movements. Because
yeah, we spoke about this a little earlier before we started filming. I think they've truncated his transformation as a character, and we're seeing more change in him in a shorter space of time than we see in the comics. And I think there's a reason for that, because there's very different audience for comic books and television shows, and the 80s versus the 2020s. And honestly, just as a quick aside, I couldn't believe that they brought in Nada. I really thought that they would drop that plot point altogether, because that just makes him almost irredeemable. Well, it may make him just functionally irredeemable, period. But they actually are going to do something with that. So, but all of that aside, they've made him grow, and so his expressions have, by the 10th episode, he's very different than the first two. But I will say this again: in the first two episodes, I never dreamed that they would find someone to play that role. I couldn't imagine someone embodying this anthropomorphic version of an idea of dreaming or the collective unconscious. And they found someone, and it's just brilliant. And his affect is perfect all the way through. I think Death.
Well, before we move on,
okay.
Before we move on to Death, I think best supporting actor from the Sandman might have to go to his cheekbones, because his cheekbones in that, whatever they did with the makeup to accentuate the sort of almost alienness of his face, I thought it was very cleverly done, because obviously in the comic book we get a lot of Dream's internal monologue, and they made a very conscious decision that a lot of the time we weren't going to get that. It was just what he said out loud, and that leaves an awful lot of weight on the actor's shoulders to try and communicate that interiority.
Well, and add to that, in the comics, all of his dialogue is white text on a black text bubble. So there's this instantaneous alienation from everybody else, that his speech is different, his presence, his existence is removed from everyone else who has, black ink on a white background. His is reversed. So we already intuitively, even we don't recognize it consciously, subconsciously, we recognize that he's separate from us. He's different. And they've how do you do that? Well, you can't just start showing text bubbles, in a TV show, because then you end up with the 1960s Batman. So and then it becomes, camp. And so how do you get away from that? Well, then it's down to the casting, the acting, the setting, the directing, the ambiance of the cinematographer, and all of this stuff, allowing that to happen. And one of the brilliances of the show is the up and down of mood and tone from episode to episode, which, one of the few times that I've ever seen this done, where in this case, a TV show, each episode feels like an individual comic. You know, the only time I've seen anything remotely close to that is Ang Lee's The Hulk, when all of his editing is based on how a comic book works. Now, he's not basing it on any particular comic, but all of the, if you go back and I recommend it highly, unlike anybody else in the known world, I'm the only person who apparently likes that film. The editing is spectacular.
I have never disagreed with you.
Related.
I have never disagreed with you about the editing on that film.
Okay.
My enjoyment,
right.
my enjoyment of that film is different from my appreciation of the technical aspects of that film.
Gotcha. But anyway, all of that to say, that's the only thing I've ever seen that approached attempting to cinematically recreate, you know, in 3 dimensions. Well, all right, in 2 dimensions, filmed in 3 dimensions, something that was originally imagined in 2 dimensions, imagining something in 3 dimensions, which in this case is actually talking about something in 4 and 5 and 12 dimensions. So it's that they've done an amazing job.
Yeah. And so it was Kirby Howell-Baptiste. I think it's Kirby Howell-Baptiste. I hope I got that right. Played Death. And I thought her characterization of Death was almost exactly spot on to the comic, with a slight change in that it updated it from that late 80s, early 90s sort of goth punk aesthetic to bringing it into something that you would actually see today. So it kind of updated the look to that. But she has that same blend. She portrays the same blend of just earnest compassion with such an upbeat, wonderful sort of warm portrayal. And it's this sort of, she takes her job as Death, her role as Death, really seriously, but it doesn't get her down because, you know, and it was so wonderful to see her bring that character to life. Like, she could light up the scenes where, you know, like she was smiling, and she was just brilliant. I really liked her version of Death.
I thought she was wonderful. I think the only thing that's lost, and it's not because of her casting and it's not because of her acting, it's just because of the time change. That in the 80s, the whole goth movement was all about dour, you know, I know this, I didn't own any clothes lighter than near black. You know, every piece of clothing I had was black. Everything in my room was black, and black light posters, you know, so I understand goth. I know it's not all about that, but anyway, but the idea of casting a goth chick as Death, one would expect that, except that in the comics she was vibrant and caring and loving and compassionate and empathetic, and so it played against that type. So the only thing lost here is that type, which can exist in, it could exist in 1989, it can't exist in 2022, not in the same way. And so that part's stripped out, but that is no function of the show itself. That's just time passing.
Yeah, and I think like that juxtaposition of the, because I think one of the issues with, even if they had done and set it in the 80s and done that, because of the evolution of the manic pixie dream girl trope and character type, I think it would have lost a lot of the resonance. But I get what you mean, because it's the presentation of her as goth, and then not acting to that type, a nice juxtaposition or contrast with that. And yeah, you don't quite get that from Howell-Baptiste's portrayal, but I think she got all of the core characters.
I'm sorry, we don't have a corresponding look today.
But that's what I mean.
With that kind of person in the 80s. It just yes, I do know some people that still have that look, but by and large, it's not a cultural touchstone in the same way it was then.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. I think she got all of the core characteristics absolutely spot on. But there's nothing you can do about, you know, changing the time period where that doesn't have the cultural touchstone or cultural resonance anymore. You have to, I think, placing it in the modern day made more sense, because otherwise, I don't know if you remember the TV show Ashes to Ashes, which was the sort of the sequel to what was the Mars one? Life on Mars. So it was Life on Mars, and then they did Ashes to Ashes. So they changed the time period to the 80s. And the thing is, it becomes slightly pastiche when you try to recreate the 80s, because it's big shoulder pads and the big chunky phone and Miami Vice and all of that. And I don't think you would have gotten the same resonance and tone to that episode of The Sound of Her Wings.
Yeah.
If you'd put it in the 80s and we're watching it today. Because I think what really strikes us about that is it's meant to be a recreation of now. And we see Death just going about her role, her function. And Dream kind of tagging along because he's a bit down because he's finished his quest. And he's like, what am I going to do now? I had a purpose. You know.
So there's still that cognitive dissonance between what we tend to think of when we think of Death and what we're given by Gaiman.
Yeah.
The only thing that's different is the goth part. But that doesn't matter. What matters is the core of that difference, which is what is the center of the conversation between the two of them. When he says, how can you keep doing this? How can you go to your job every day? How do you live with what you do? And she says, they just need a friendly smile and a caring person and a hand to lift them up. I'm not getting the line right, but that's basically what they're passing from one existence into another, and they just need to feel unafraid. And that's not, you know, the skeleton in a
cowl with the scythe and the whole Grim
with
Reaper.
A scythe and, you know, vultures sitting on his shoulders, and you know, it's all that's not what Gaiman's doing. It's this is, and she says, we, you know, and this becomes the lesson for Dream himself. We're not serving they're not serving us, we're serving them, right? We're here to guide them through whatever it is. So whether it's death or whether it's dream or whether it's desire or despair or delirium or destiny or destruction.
And actually, mentioning desire, that was Mason Alexander Park. They played Desire, and I was in two minds, because I couldn't imagine anyone really playing Desire. I didn't think they would ever be able to find anyone to make Desire come alive on screen, and yet Mason Park did an incredible job. Like they are with the glowing gold eyes, the throaty voice, it was such a, like, I know I am being very effusive about this show, but I was so impressed by it, because these characters were so difficult to encapsulate how you would communicate them.
Yeah.
And the fact that they managed to find these actors, and not only that, get the performances from the actors that so accurately made these characters come to life. And Mason Park, I thought, was stunning as Desire.
And even and again, I want to get it, walked into minutia, but even the set for Desire's domain, it's the chambers of a heart. That's where he, she, they exist. Is in a heart, and the sigil is the heart. And how do you it's maybe a little easier to imagine death because we've seen so many images of death, and we've seen so many images of well, I guess maybe, well, all right, destiny. Some of them are easy, but dream, desire, despair, delirium, these things are harder. And how do you do that? Well, they make the domain a heart, and they are there, and they are neither male nor female. They are everything one could desire. And that's true from the comics through to the show. And I don't want to get too much into this because I don't want to give these idiots airtime, but I get a little upset about people being upset about casting and changing casting when this is the way it was in the comic, and this is Gaiman's imagining. This is the way it was supposed to be. This is the way it makes sense. And even if it wasn't in the original, it still works. In this case, it works in both ways because, well, it's the same.
Well,
and it's beautiful. That's
one
what
of
desire is. It's everything. What do you want? Even what does dream want? I mean, there's this thing at the end where it feels like, oh well, desire is threatening dream. That's not it at all. Desire is actually trying to give dream what he wants, which is something else, to change things, because dream has grown tired. That's why he's sitting on a bench feeding pigeons.
And like one of the interesting things is the episode 24/7, which I have to admit is not one of my favorite early issues of the Sandman. The reason being, I'm a bit squeamish.
Yeah.
And that is a very disturbing issue.
Yeah.
And obviously one of the big changes they made for the TV show was they took out a lot of the DC references, the DC superhero references.
Yes. No Martian Manhunter, no Batman, no Legion of Superheroes. Even Dr. D says when his mom asks him, so something about, or someone asked him, how did you get there? He said, oh, some people put me here. It wasn't the Justice League put me in Arkham Asylum. It's some people put me here. So they strip all of that out, which makes sense.
And the thing was, when I was reading the Sandman, I wasn't a big DC reader. I didn't read a lot of the DC comic books. And so, when Etrigan, the demon, is there and speaking, and I had to go and ask someone, am I meant to recognize this? And my friend had to explain it to me, which is fine. Since then I've read some, but obviously one of those changes was
I had to collect the demon over here. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But because they took those things out, I think that streamlined a lot of stuff. It made it less that it was connecting to that DC cinematic universe, the DC shows, any of what is expected about a superhero show. It was making it feel much more its own entity. And I think that was actually a very smart move, because the Sandman really has, it kind of exists as its own thing. It's not
Yeah.
really
They
integrated.
were forcing him in the first few years to play by their playbook, and they wanted him to include these characters. They wanted him to you know, I don't want to say ingratiate himself, but that's part of the what, the gauntlet that one has to run when one begins. And so a lot of that stuff had to be there for the suits. But as it became its own thing, as it became incredibly popular, he was able to have more and more freedom. And so the dreaming grew beyond, well beyond the mythology, became its own separate mythology. And that's brilliant. And we'll come back to this later. I don't want to get derailed too much now, but my fear is what's going to happen in the Season of Mists when you have Thor and Loki. So I don't know how that's going to work, but we'll deal with that later.
Yeah, that's a problem for another day. But
yeah,
one of the things about 24/7 that, and the casting of John Dee that I was surprised about, was they cast David Thewlis, who, phenomenal actor,
phenomenal,
but compared to how the character was realized in the comic, completely different. He plays him in a completely different way. He looks completely different, and yet that storyline still absolutely works.
And by the way, the fanboys upset about the casting of Death or Lucifer or Desire have said nothing about Dee. They've said nothing about other characters who've been radically changed. But yeah, they're only complaining about people of color and different gender identification.
But the way that Thewlis played Dee was utterly convincing, worked with the story, and also they toned down some of those horror elements and the squeamish elements, for which I am actually very grateful. And yet it still contained that core of horror. It still contained all of those elements. And Thewlis played him in such a way that you're almost sympathetic, whereas it's very hard to be sympathetic to John Dee in the comic.
But, well, because he looks like a Thanos version of Gollum. I mean, you know, he's a purple creature that's utterly inhuman, desiccated and anyway, yeah. So, but well, first of all, he's my favorite mentor to Harry Potter. You know, who doesn't love a nice werewolf? But he's a fantastic actor, and so much of that was played with such pathos. When he's in the back of the car, you know, being driven to get his ruby, and he's talking, just talking. Yeah, I murdered some people, but they deserved it. You know, and I can't do it because I'm not an actor. And he's, oh my God, he's perfect. And you're watching her in the front seat going, you know, looking up in the rearview mirror, and it's like, oh my God, I'm gonna die. But then you go back to him, and he's not a threat. It's just what he's saying is terrifying.
And that again, that dichotomy between like his almost projected innocence, that he is completely and utterly unaware in certain circumstances that this is wrong in any way. And then another thing, you know, that he actually knows, no, that it's that complexity that he managed to get across, I think elevated the character of Dee in the TV show in a way that I didn't get from the comics, because in the comics he is clearly a monster.
Yeah.
In the comics he is playing with people. They are his playthings. But here it's this earnest, but I don't want anyone to lie. And
I want to save the world.
And it
Which,
gives us,
by the way, again, all of the themes, and we've talked about this before, all of the themes repeat and echo each other in an ever increasing series of ripples throughout the show, which is what makes it a great show. It's not the casting, and it's not the acting, and it's not the cinematography. All of that's fantastic. It's these themes and the writing that make it brilliant. And the idea that he's trying to make things better, and in this case, not, in the same way that Dream is trying to make things better, and sometimes not, and Death is trying to make things better, and only at the end, when it doesn't matter for this life, and right. So it's again and again, it's all about trying to make a better world. And then that ties into the whole idea of multiple worlds, multiple realms, multiple lords, multiple drivers of multiple desires, and we're all trying to have a better life. And that's he's trying. He's doing it terribly, but he doesn't know.
And that's one of the things that I really liked about this. They could have made it really, really obvious that at the heart of everything, at the heart of all of these stories, is a desire.
Yes.
And the writing is so good that every single one of the sort of the stories that we get in this narrative is all being tied up into the machinations of desire.
Yes.
And it was so well done. Like when people talk about, writing being, this is excellent writing all the way through, that it's not in your face. And even when desire actually sort of almost confesses to camera that they are messing with Dream, it's not spelled out that when you think of every single episode, every single thing has been about desire. Desire has been the puppet master.
Desire, or her twin. Despair.
Yeah.
The heart and the hook. Right? So they both pull us. And as we know from Hellraiser, not Clive Barker, but well, yeah, actually Clive Barker.
Didn't they rename it Hellblazer because of that?
Yeah, not Hellblazer, but Hellraiser, where the Cenobites pull your body apart using hooks, right? So you can be drawn, or you can be quartered, right? And that's the two sides, and they honestly, they're thematically, they're more important than death or dream or destiny or destruction or delirium.
But one of the things I really liked was obviously the comic
Although I'm
book.
a pretty good fan of delirium. So
everyone's a fan of delirium. But the comic book, obviously very, very episodic. That's what the comic book is. This was a sequence of individual issues. And yeah, they match those into the TV show. But being aware of modern sensibilities of how we like connected arcs, adding in the Corinthian earlier as a point of connection all the way through, not to be the ultimate bad guy, not to be the big bad. He wasn't the adversary. The Corinthian was added in as a connecting thread that sewed everything together.
Because even he doesn't, he's like D. He's not doing things to hurt people. He's doing things because it's what he's believes needs to be done. It's what Dream made him to do. It's what, and I hate to be, doing this and being, pleading about the world's first serial killer who imbued all the others with the desire to kill people in massive numbers. But he's, the way they present him here, and in many ways in the comic, he's meant to show us what could happen if we fail. And then when Dream says, "You have failed," and he says, "But that's what you made me to do." I love Hannibal, the TV show, as much as any other horror person on the planet, because it's the darkest thing that's ever been filmed, bar none, period. No film, nothing matches that show. But I never felt this way about a character. I didn't feel this way about Hannibal in the way that I feel about the freaking Corinthian.
But one of the things I loved about, and they kept it from the comic book, is when Dream's unmaking the Corinthian, it's because the Corinthian didn't do enough. He goes like, "You've been on Earth all this time, and this is all that you've achieved. You should have done more." And we are so preconditioned to think, "Oh, Dream's going to come in and punish him," and yet Dream does, but Dream's not punishing him for inspiring serial killers. He's punishing him because he didn't aim high enough.
Well, that's what I said, because you failed, right? So yeah, but it's clearer in the comic. You haven't done enough to do enough damage to stop people from doing that kind of damage, right? So yeah, but yeah, it's Gaiman's not an easy read, and he's not a simple writer. And anyone who wants to talk about comic books being for children needs to go home and just go to sleep for about 100 years.
Well, let's talk about one character change that I know that you were very trepidatious about because you're such a fan of the character.
Oh God.
And this
now we're just going to get me angry, and you won't like me when I'm angry.
But Jenna Coleman's portrayal of Johanna Constantine.
All right, she's great. I love her. I love the portrayal. I love what they did. And as far as the show is concerned, it works and it's brilliant. Anyone who has ever been a fan of Hellblazer or
Swamp Thing,
or Swamp Thing, or what we call in America Constantine, which Alan Moore clearly said was Constantine, and in the show makes clear it's Constantine. All right, fine. I'm just going to keep saying Constantine because I'm an idiot.
Well, we'll switch to Constantine then, because you're my guest.
All right. But anyone who's a fan of that character understands that so much of the identity of that character is involved in being a toxic male. But the character of Constantine is so very specific to me. I had the same trouble when they made him American. That I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually like Keanu Reeves' film.
There were bits
even though he's terrible in so many ways, but he's also brilliant in other ways. It works. And having said again, Johanna works. She's great. So I, you know what? It's like people who talk about certain words. Well, that word doesn't mean that anymore. Or that word has always meant this. Well, it doesn't mean that anymore. It means something else. It's changed. It's evolved. And comic books change and evolve. Superman didn't have a cape. Now he has a cape. Superman couldn't fly. Now he flies. Superman didn't have X-ray vision. Now he has X-ray vision. Superman didn't have heat vision. He didn't have super breath. He didn't have cold breath. He didn't have, he didn't have a reaction to kryptonite. All of these things change over time because different writers take over and they take it in a different direction. And so I'm fine with that. It's just my original visceral reaction to a female Constantine troubled me, but she did a very great job with it. And I'm very interested to see where it goes.
Yeah.
And it could be this whole other thing.
Because one of the things I liked, because obviously she is not John Constantine, she's Johanna Constantine. But they kept the bisexuality, they kept the backstory, they kept the fact that she's an asshole. They kept all of the traits basically of John Constantine, and you go, right, so she's performing the same function. She's arrogant and brash and
not as much of an asshole, but yes, an asshole.
Yeah. But they kept all of those elements, and I went, okay. And I think HBO Max is doing a John Constantine show. So, if we're gonna swap one episode of The Sandman for an entire season on HBO Max, I think that's a fair trade. We're gonna get John Constantine. And
well, here's the thing. They tried a whole series of, first they tried a franchise and it didn't take off because it was too dark. The one with Keanu Reeves. And then they tried a whole series and it didn't take off.
I like that.
So then they meshed him into the whole Arrowverse, and that still didn't, that character didn't take off. Well, try it a different way. This is what comics have always done. This is why we have a female Thor. This is why we have a black Green Lantern. This is why we have just Green Lantern. This is why we have 3, 4, 10, 12, 40 different Green Lanterns.
And how many different versions of the Flash do we have?
Oh my Lord, depending on which universe you're talking about, a bunch. So this is what comics, let me rephrase. This is what mythology is about. It's about suiting the needs of the people in the time that they need messages. And the stories, they either stay and get retold again and again and again, or they fade. And the only way that they get retold again and again and again is that they get reimagined.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, but the story of Superman is the story of Moses, and the story of Moses is the story of Zoroaster, and the story of Zoroaster goes further back than that. So I mean, we go back and back and back. The story of Wonder Woman goes all the way back to Inanna and others. So we retell these stories, we reimagine them, and so I understand all of that. It's what I do. It's what I love. It's what makes me happy. It's what gives me faith in the human race, that we are able to continue telling stories, which is also, by the way, the heart of Sandman. It's all about telling stories, and we hear that between this, when Hob and Sandman are talking at the bar. It's all about telling stories.
And
when decision. He goes into that whole business with what's going to happen later with Dream Country and Shakespeare and the play that he writes for Titania and Oberon and all of that. So that's where it all resides. It's just in my heart of hearts, I wanted to see another Constantine that I was familiar with, but that's okay. I'm fine with that because I know that these things change.
And see, one of the reasons why I actually wanted to talk to you about it was I know you are an absolute huge fan of John Constantine. I know you are, and we both knew that that was a change that they had made in the show, and we could talk about the fact that there are rights issues over the character, and it was going to be complicated, and it was just easier to do a Johanna Constantine because Gaiman owns the rights for that character. But that's irrelevant because ultimately the character still served the same function to the story and the plot. The character was still true to the essence of what was going on, even though it differed from the comic. And it still worked. It still communicated the same thing. And it was like Gwendoline Christie's Lucifer. I thought she did an amazing job because she's so tall. And the way that they played it for A Hope in Hell, particularly changing her as being
doesn't begin to cover it. She's like,
but obviously because it was Coronazon is who Dream is meant to be fighting, but setting it up that it is now Lucifer. And
yeah,
we have
nice change.
I thought it was so well done because yes, not only is Dream weakened, we know Dream is weakened, and Dream's already said Lucifer is the second most powerful entity in creation. And then this is physically represented on the screen by Gwendoline Christie towering over him. And she played it so smugly that the arrogance, the pride, the hubris, all of those aspects of Lucifer. Now, she didn't play it as a cold, detached, cruel, or she didn't play it as charming. She played it with a smug arrogance. And it was that so well done because you go, yeah.
Well, and setting it up for what will be the next cycle, provided they get a second season, which I'm assuming. I mean, we talked about this before the show. Number one in 80 plus countries, this show. I mean, it's going to have a second. I don't know about a third or a fourth, but it's going to have a second. And that second season will be Season of Mists, which is one of the 3 great compilation graphic novels in global history. I mean, it's Watchmen, it's this, and it's a couple of other things, but it's this, and it's going to be Season of Mists, and that ending of her overlooking pandemonium, and you know, this idea that she's going to make she's going to upset God and make Dream suffer or kneel. And it's not what anyone imagines. And I don't know if I want to give the spoiler.
No, we won't spoil it. But I do like the way.
But what she does is not what anyone imagines. It's extraordinary.
But there is a wonderful expression in English is that Lucifer is planning to raise a little hell.
Yes.
But one of the points that you sort of brought up with Hobgolding.
Sell it off for parts. Sorry.
But with Hobgolding, the way they married Hobb's story into that issue of A Sign of Her Wings and blended the 2 stories together, I thought I was actually really, really impressed with that. That it just moved so seamlessly into that. Let's go back through the ages because again, it ties in with Dream had been talking with Death, goes back to one of the last times they'd been wandering around, and then moves through with the story with Hob. And obviously like the tinkering with the timeline that the show did to make it in the modern day meant that some of the aspects of that, and they decided, no, we're just going to keep it for 89. And so he's really late for this one.
Yeah.
But I thought that was so wonderfully done because we get to see that change to dream that I was kind of alluding to, that I think they've accelerated that for the TV show to make the character a bit more, not necessarily likable, but to reach out to the audience a bit more, to give them something more to invest in, that he isn't just.
What's so, I'm sorry, but what's so beautiful about those particular sequences is that's where we actually see Dream change. And so they saved any change at all for that episode. And so the first 2 meetings, maybe 2.5, 3 meetings, he's implacable. He's Dream with the stars in his eyes, literally, cheekbones that could cut, slivers out of the time-space continuum. But then he begins to slowly, century at a time, understand something about the human experience that he didn't understand before, which is they aren't endless. And it's not that they're not of the family of endless. It's that they aren't endless. They are mortal. And coming to understand, well, there's a reason why one of the last volumes is called Brief Lives. I mean, that's crucial. Understanding that our lives are this, and eternity, or the endless, is everything else, going back around and coiling in upon itself. So as he meets him again and again, he gradually comes to, and we see a change overcome not only his haircut, although I will say he looks better with long hair.
You're not biased.
I'm not biased at all. But my wife even said, he looks so much better with long hair. I said, yeah, I love you. But it's not just, it's his demeanor, everything, his acting, his vocalizations, everything begins to gradually change until he arrives. And it's so heartbreaking when he arrives at the gate, in front of this place that's been, closed off. And it says the new inn that way, basically in graffiti. And he's looking at this place, and you see this, his face has just fallen because he knows that he messed up the last time they met. He's maybe lost a friend. He may have a friend. What the fuck does that mean? Sorry, I don't know if I can say that, but and this place has changed, and it's all Trumpville now, and now we've got to go over to this place that's, not a golf course, and he's just ashen. And then when he walks over, and then he sees him, and he lights up, and that's a whole different dream, literally, figuratively. Yeah. And that sequence, it tells you everything about Dream's journey in that, what 20 minutes.
It was exquisitely well done. And of course, like, so much of that is from the comics and just tweaked a little to fit it in. But also seeing Hobbs journey, and how Hob, living it up, becoming a slave trader. And that's the one time you see Dream criticizes him.
Yeah.
And you can see he's kind of shocked by it. And then, of course, the next time you see he's haunted by it because he didn't learn his lessons. And I think that it's very difficult because sometimes I think we want very overt recognition of something so horrible. And yet, how forgive me, I cannot remember the actor's name, but how he portrays that, he goes, I've made some mistakes. He's very reticent, and you can see he is actually, I think we're meant to read that is he is really troubled by it.
But he lives in a time where he can't necessarily fully admit it yet, because the times haven't changed enough for him to change his head, because the time keeps reinforcing the old thoughts. Yeah.
And so I think seeing Hobbes change over time and how that is actually an acceleration of a mirroring of what we get with Dream. So again, like there's so many really nice elements that they did in this, like changing when Dream initially needed the power, instead of Cain and Abel's contracts, dissolving the gargoyle, and you go, oh, that it was intensely manipulative, and they knew exactly what they were doing to really sell that to the audience, that this is a sacrifice, this is terrible, this is a cost. Whereas if it had just been the original bits of paper, that's harder to convey what they mean. But
I mean, first of all, Cain and Abel and Gregory, well, Cain, Abel, and Eve and Gregory go all the way back to the 40s, when a House of Secrets, House of Mysteries, and Witching Hour, and then eventually in the 60s, Plop came out. So those characters stretch back 80 some odd years, okay? In the comics, I understand that Cain and Abel and Eve much further than that, but in the comics, there were 3 comics that had hosts. If any of your watchers have seen Tales from the Crypt, you've got the Crypt Keeper, who tells the stories and cackles maniacally,
or Elvira and all
that. Yeah. So these were some of those. These were those first stories that were done that way. And Cain had a comic, and Abel had a comic, and Eve had a comic. It was a House of Secrets, House of Mysteries, and Witching Hour. And then Abel had a pet, Gregory, the gargoyle. And then they kind of got made fun of and played with in a satirical way in a brief-lived comic in the late 60s, early 70s called Plop, which was a sort of a DC knockoff of Mad Magazine. And we got to see them all playing it out again in that way, in a funny way. But it was always, Cain killing Abel over and over and over and over and over again, and then feeding somebody to Gregory, and Eve, manipulating things. And so this was another one of the things that DC wanted Gaiman to use. Gaiman was delighted to use them and made them major characters eventually. Having said all of that, having just really become a dog person in the last year and a half, I was always a cat person, and now suddenly, God help me, I'm a dog person. I've fallen in love with our dog. He's only a year and a half, so he's still basically a puppy. Watching Sandman kill Gregory I thought I was going to never watch the show after that. Because it was really hard.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's what my students say when I teach I Am Legend, and they're like, oh yeah, well, all of humanity has died, but when they kill the dog, that's when we stopped reading. It's you know, it's just this thing we have with these creatures that we fall in love with. And so yeah, that was brutal, but I'm with you. I understand why they did it, because they needed to show A, that there was something at stake. B, they wanted to show the hard-heartedness and the just the single-mindedness of Morpheus. Um and they wanted to pull our heartstrings.
Yeah.
Our heartstrings with hooks.
Do you think maybe we're overselling the theme?
No.
Uh, all in all, I mean, I think my quibbles with the show are a couple of very minor costuming things. The battle in hell, the costuming decision for that battle, because I loved the vaudeville nightclub that Coronazon had created in the comic, and the sort of the all black PVC leather kind of look.
Well, in the comic, fishnets and garters.
But Dream with his is it a trilby or a? But he has a hat. But anyway, so the costuming on that, I wasn't sold on, and you know, I think I've said previously that Matthew's intervention in the battle, I thought.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about the in the comic. It's one clothing. It's very different in the show.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that the helm that Dream wears is goes maybe another episode.
No,
of
but
this
they
talk about the history of Sandman, but yeah, it's based on the very first Sandman, which is different.
And he had the gas mask, but
yeah,
no, but I'm talking about in the battle with Lucifer in the TV show, versus the battle with Coronazon in the comic, because Dream's sitting in the audience and he's wearing a hat because it's like a speakeasy.
Oh yeah.
And he sort of like he gets up on stage and then they have this battle, and but you know that's so minor, incredibly minor. The intervention of Matthew in the battle with Lucifer, I can understand why, but again, it was a minor, a very minor, weaker note in it, because I loved the fact that Dream had created a trap for Coronazon, whereas in this it seemed that he was beaten and then Matthew gives him the inspiration and then he wins. And it was just that minor moment sort of, I think, detracted from Dream's cunning, his power, his drive, those aspects. And yet I can see how it accelerated the major theme of it, which is about Dream slowly changing and recognizing the people around him and becoming more reliant on them.
You know, some of that has to do with some of those demons had showed up in Hellblazer. And so comic book fans who were crossovers from Hellblazer to Sandman, which of course DC was counting on, were expecting certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that happens, then we're expecting, you know, this note, and then Gaiman just says, well, screw it, we're just going to play a completely different tune, and by the way, it's going to be in a minor key. Not that the other wasn't in a minor key. Anyway, it's just that I again, mythologies evolve, and I don't have a problem with it. It's when you know, in as much as I adore what they did with Moon Knight, when they do things that simply don't make sense,
Yeah.
with like what they did with some of the plot points and the god ideation, the way that they created them and gave them powers or didn't give them powers or didn't explain the powers, or you know, some of those things. um Again, I love the show as a whole, but those things really bothered me. None of that is true for Sandman for me.
Yeah.
I'm with you. It's just, it's little stuff that
And
really
even
doesn't
then,
matter.
it's not so much the things I'm talking about. It's not so much that they are, oh well, that, I didn't like. It's almost like they're just a slightly weaker note. So it's still playing the note. It's just it's not quite hitting the same resonance. And when I think of the show that particularly like The Doll's House is a very complicated story to try and communicate when you can't just sort of pause and go back over the pages and read backwards and forwards and link things up. There was a lot going on in The Doll's House as a story, and the interconnection of the different stories and the different dreams, and Rose Walker, and linking it back to the sleeping sickness. And
Yes.
like, it's a very complicated sequence. And the fact that they managed to reproduce that in a really coherent manner, even though
In a few episodes, like 3. Whereas in the comic, it's like, well, it's that thick.
Yeah.
That's a lot of comic book pages.
Um,
For those of you who don't know, average comic book around, well, used to be 24 pages. That's a bunch of pages.
So like, I was really impressed with it and how they managed to change, like, was it the who were the superhero couple? Was it Hector and Lita?
Yes, Lida, yeah.
Lida. Um, that wouldn't have worked today because there isn't the same background for those superheroes. So transferring all of that onto Jed.
Oh well. Oh, for God's sake! Because oh, do you? Okay, maybe I shouldn't go into this. Maybe I should just shut up. That's a huge backstory that goes back to the original Hawkman and Hawkgirl.
Yeah,
and Egyptian gods, and
it is far too complicated to try and suddenly explain in this show that is, one would assume for audiences who have not.
And by the way, it involves the original Sandman, the second Sandman, and the new Sandman. And the second Sandman is not who you thought was the second Sandman. He's actually an imposter who is the son of these Egyptian gods who are the original Hawkwoman and Hawkgirl, who weren't the real Hawkwoman and Hawkgirl that we know now, or the new Hawkwoman and Hawkgirl, because those were the real ones and these are the fake ones, but those were anyway. And so now here's this guy who's the son, and he gets sucked into the dreaming and gets trapped there by two characters that in the Jack Kirby version of Sandman were his slaves that he kept in glass boxes or glass tubes, Brute and Glob, and they're actually the ones running the show instead of the slaves. And
Yeah,
I'll shut up.
But that's what I mean.
It's complicated.
And so streamlining that, you have to admit, like, sitting down, looking at the complexity of that and what we're meant to, when we're reading the comic, what we're meant to draw from it, what we're meant to infer from it, what the knowledge that you need to decode some of that. And they went, we can't expect an audience to do that. And so that involves some clever rewriting. And what they put on the screen, I was so, again, impressed with it. It got across all of those elements without that background knowledge.
And okay, I'm going to show off just for half a second. And at the same time show just how stupid and fucked up I am. When I was a kid, I was deeply transformed for the first time by a comic book, by a series of comics called Sandman. And this was the Jack Kirby version. Started in 60. Well, doesn't matter. The version that I'm familiar with, there were only 7 issues. 7 comic books changed my life. This is what myth can do. And those 7 issues informed basically everything we've talked about today. Because that reimagining of Sandman created a place called the Dreaming. It created acolytes to the Dream Lord, originally Brute and Glob, but now Merv and
Lucian,
Matthew and Lucian, and on and on and on. Cain and Abel and all of that. Although they existed actually before. Anyway, so it's complicated. But but the Dreaming, the acolytes, the whole idea of moving in and out of dreams, trying to save people from dreams that had gotten out of hand, nightmares like the Corinthian, although back then they weren't like that. They weren't serial killers, but basically they were. They just didn't have teeth for eyes. They were just, nebulous masses of goo. So all of these things came out in those comics, and it made me realize what comic books could do. And that's when I went and started picking up things like the comics that still existed, House of Mystery and House of Secrets and Witching Hour, and then of course my family thought I was going to hell, and they're probably right, but it's all of that comes from 7, technically 6 issues, with 1 extra issue that included saving Santa Claus. So I'm not sure I really want to count that one. So 6 issues, 6 20 to 25 page comic books changed everything. It's about story. The story grows, the story changes, the story informs us, the story tells us who we are, what we want, what we desire, what we dream, where we're headed, what is our destiny, what is death. All of these things, that's what Gaiman is aware of. And regardless of whether DC made him or didn't make him do these things, and I could be wrong about a few of those points, he understood all of that in a way that very few other writers, except maybe Alan Moore, understand. And that's here. It's all present in this show. And it's just astonishing.
And that's one of the things that I absolutely adore about the Sandman comic books. That story, the power of story, and the different types of story, mythologies, quests, battles against evil, storytelling competitions. There are so many different types of story wrapped up in it. And like, obviously, you know me, you know how obsessed I am with aspects of narrative.
Yes.
But this is something that I think came across, the power of story, the power of these different dreams, these stories, to shape lives, to shape our world. That, and even the 24/7 being locked, the horror in a lockbox, sort of enclosed, encapsulated story.
Because of the stories they tell themselves.
And then like the walking through the quest through hell to fight at the end of it. You're saying a quest story. the horror of, you know, the serial killer convention and someone being hunted. All of these, the superhero story with Jed, that there are all these different types of story being told within a story. And, you know, that's my bread and butter. Story within story within story. Of course I love this stuff.
And by the way, Jed's wearing the costume that the Jack Kirby Sandman wears.
That
So,
I didn't know. 'Cause I
yeah.
thought this, for some reason, I have in my head that he had like a fedora and a gas, like a World War II gas mask.
That's the original.
Oh, okay.
That's the original Sandman. Then the Kirby Sandman is the one with the yellow tights and the and Glob and Brute and all of that. So that's what Jed is wearing. Yeah, and what's her name? Galt.
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 Yeah. She takes the place of Glob and Brute.
Yeah.
And they make her far more. Again, one of the changes, they make her far more human, far more interesting, far more sympathetic. And when Sandman dispenses with her, it's brutal. It's like watching, you know, any of the other characters
and
die
yet,
but on steroids, and it's like, no. And then he comes back and renews her and makes her instead of a nightmare into a dream. And so those changes, again, the story is new, the story is now, let's tell it now, because, you know, Gaiman and the others who have loved him, and clearly the people who made this show love his work, because they're not just, by the way, they're not just borrowing stuff from Sandman, they're taking lines from books of magic and other stories that he's written. Stardust, I mean, it stretches out everywhere. They're pulling all of this stuff in, pulling in story to tell a story for now, because it's what we need now.
Yeah. And
if we ever needed a Sandman, we need it now.
And that change to Galt, that the fact that it is transformative. So not only is Dream at the end changed, because he's admitted a mistake. Dream doesn't admit making mistakes. Yeah. He apologizes to Lucien, and trusts Lucien to do things, and recreates Galt and makes her a dream. Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Dum, 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 dum.
Yes.
And that subtle thing about transformation, and again, like we see that with like, obviously that's part of the Doll's House storyline as well. Like, so much of this is well done, and even like little visual representations of ensuring that the audience picks up on the fact that the dream vortex, the icon representing it, is Desire's sigil.
Yes.
You know, but they don't go dun, 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 you know, big close up, look at this, red lights. It's because it's, oh, I've taken out my heart, and in the sequence you go, oh, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And you don't think about it, but then of course we get the movement to Dream going to see Desire, and we see Desire's gallery, and we're in the heart, and Dream has been holding the same sigil. That there are some really clever aspects to the writing. But
yeah, we wait. We travel into the heart to discover what we truly desire, so that we can dream a different dream to follow our destiny. You know, I'm sorry, I have to do this because it's there.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Bryan, thank you very much. I loved, like, we could probably go on for quite some more time about this.
Oh my God, because, you know, I actually have 5 of the first 6 issues of that run of Sandman. I sold my Gaiman Sandman, sadly, but most of them, not all of them, I still have a bunch. but not the early ones. I sold those. But I still have the Jack Kirby stuff, because that will be pried from my cold dead hands by John D. In a diner somewhere. But yeah, I this means so much to me. We could do more on it.
Yeah, because I genuinely loved this adaptation. It wasn't how I had pictured it, and yet it it works. It's not what was in my head, but when I watched it, I went, yeah, but how else would you picture it? It was so good. I really, really enjoyed it.
Now it's gonna be hard to read the comics again.
No,
No, all right, no, it's not.
no. But Bryan, thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. I thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
And for those of you still watching, thank you so much. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.